History Project: The USA and the Events in Cuba from 1959 to 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis was the closest point the world ever got to nuclear war. Why was this, and how did we get to this point? We will soon discover. Cuba is an island quite near the coast of Florida. Until 1959, it was allied with the U.S. under the leadership of right-wing dictator General Batista. As they worked closely with each other, the two developed a close economic relationship, with Cuba selling its sugar and tobacco to the United States. The Cuban Revolution started with Fidel Castro's attempt to overthrow its government, which resulted in the fall of Batista's dictatorship. The revolution was fueled by its big economic inequalities, political repression, and corruption under the dictatorship. Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, and others launched the guerrilla campaign against the government. It promised to revolutionize how Cuban people lived on the island, with new improved education, healthcare, and the eradication of corruption. Thanks to this, the revolution gained the support of the population. As Batista fled the country, a new chapter opened for Cuba. The government, led by Fidel Castro, embarked on its journey to rebuild the nation, but as Cuba became socialist, communist, and took control of American property on the island, ties with the USA weakened. So they turned to the communist superpower, the Soviet Union. Few years after Castro's rise to power in the island took place, the U.S. military tried to invade Cuba but failed. John F. Kennedy, the newly elected USA president, planned to invade Cuba with the help of anti-communist party on the island. The CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, landed 1,400 ex-Cubans who were sent to exile to the Bay. The Bay of Pigs is a 200 inlet on the southern coast of Cuba, located about 150 kilometers southeast of Havana. It's characterized by its remote, swampy geography, bordered on the west by extensive swamp and on the east by rocky mangrove-covered coastline. The plan was cancelled last minute, leaving the rebels to be easily defeated by Cuban troops. This showcased the lack of planning from the president. The plan was cancelled last minute, leaving the rebels to be easily defeated by the Cuban troops. Caused the Cuban government to ask for the USSR to support them in case America tried to strike again. So Khrushchev secretly started to place Russian missiles in Cuba. They hoped this action would discourage another invasion. They also hoped that the missile could be used to bargain with the US to remove NATO's missiles in Turkey. NATO's missiles, especially US nuclear weapons, were stationed in Turkey primarily to deter Soviet aggression during the Cold War, act as a strategic hack to close to the Soviet border, and reinforce NATO's collective defense. Deployed starting in 1959, these weapons provide a rapid response capability against Soviet advancement. On the night of October 13, 1962, American spy planes left their base from Edwards Air Force Base in Orlando, California. On board of the two U-2 planes were Lieutenant Colonel Richard S. Hayes and Major Rudolph Anderson, flew over Cuba's night sky and secretly took pictures of Soviet nuclear missile sites being built. With this top-notch information, President Kennedy met with his advisors in secret, since he did not want the Soviet Union or Cuba to know about the missile's discovery. The planes then went back to their Florida base around afternoon of the 14th of October. After 13 long days and difficult meetings, Kennedy decided to place a naval blockade around Cuba. Its aim was to prevent the Soviets from giving more supplies to the island. On October 22, 1962, President Kennedy spoke to the nation on national television. The tone of the president's remark was stern, and the message unmistakable and evocative of the Monroe Doctrine. It shall be policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliation response upon the Soviet Union, as President Kennedy quoted. The same day, Kennedy sent a letter to Khrushchev declaring that the United States will not permit offensive weapons to be delivered to Cuba, and that demanded that the Soviet dismantle the missile base already under construction or completed, and return all offensive weapons on the USSR. The letter was the first in a series of direct and indirect communication between the White House and the Kremlin throughout the remainder of the crisis. On October 27, 1962, the war came to a stop and waited. This was the closest humanity had ever been to a eruption of nuclear war. Castro wrote a letter to Khrushchev to prepare for an American invasion on the island, and wanted the Soviet allies to deliver the first blow. The two opposite leaders agreed to get rid of their nuclear bases, the Cuban and the Turkish bases, even if the Turkish government was opposed to it. Later during the day, air spy Rudolf Anderson took in-depth photographs of the secret nuclear base, and as the Cuban defense knew that if he went back to America, their enemy would have deeper knowledge of the situation, they decided to shoot him, and he died on impact. This was the crisis' first casualty. After news of the spy's takedown started to circle the White House, the president decided to write to Nikolae Khrushchev and agreed to not invade Cuba, get rid of Turkish nuclear sites, but for Soviet missiles to be removed completely from Cuba. This was the last hope for the country to not go to war. Just before the message was sent, the American Navy finally found the 4 Soviet submarines that were circulating the Atlantic since the start of the war, and as they closed by on them, the Soviet crew decided to launch their nuclear torpedoes, but changed their plan last minute. This decision prevented the outbreak of nuclear war. This day will be remembered as Black Saturday, and go down as one of the most dangerous days that humanity had ever faced. Thankfully, resolution came quickly. The next morning, as Khrushchev agreed to the terms laid by President Kennedy, the nuclear sites and weapons were removed from the island, Turkish missiles bases quietly dismantled, and the blockade was over. Even not all were happy with the outcome of the crisis, it was averted and safety was restored.